let's begin. Firstly, before we do, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Importantly, I extend that, of course, that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'm David Lambert, I'm Dean of Research for Griffith Sciences, and I hear there's a big storm coming, so just as well you made it, because you may not make it home. But thanks very much for coming. So this, as you would know, and I won't keep you very long because I think the last thing you want to hear is a whole lot of stuff from me. But just very briefly, the university started these impact lectures 2 years ago, and the goal of the lectures was to engage with a diverse range of industry and governments and professionals right across the scientific sphere, right into engineering communities, for example. So a very diverse array of people. The Impact Lecture Series has reasonably worked, I think, because over the last year or so we've discussed all sorts of topics, from climate change to, at the other end of the spectrum, the revelations in science that have been caused by 3D printing, for example, and the dramatic changes that is going to have on society in general. So the topic for today is rather different again. This is really with respect to the challenges of food and water security. But before I do that, I do just want to acknowledge some of the people in the audience. We've got people from SEQ Water, from Brisbane City Council, Queensland State Government, including the Department of Environment and Heritage, the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and the Department of Science, Information Technology and Innovation. We've got a whole lot of people from universities, from UQ, from Queensland University of Technology, Bond University, and even the University of Singapore, and representatives of Queensland Education and Jeff O'Connell Consulting Proprietary Limited. So a diverse array of people. Just a sentence or two from me about the importance of impact. This is one of the ways in which one of the major changes that have occurred in universities, particularly in the last couple of years, where universities recognised that it wasn't just the kind of purely academic achievements that they have, but really it was more to do with what the impact of those kinds of achievements was, and the diversity of them, and the people and the organisations that the university's research actually touches. Griffith Sciences is a major component of the research activities of the university as a whole. In very general terms, we amount to at least half of the entire university's output in research terms. So impact is very important for all universities. So tonight we're going to tackle one of these really important problems to do with food and water security. We think about water security usually in times of drought. When I came back to Australia in 2007, 2008, we were in the midst of a terrible drought, and most people used to look at their websites every day to see what the volume was, and I think we got down to 16% capacity in the dams and so forth. And then, and of course, before you look around, this part of the world has another major flood. So we think about these kinds of things usually at times like that. The important thing about this is that it's not just a scientific problem, it's a cultural problem in the broadest sense as well. And so the solutions to the problem really come out of a mixture of science and socially driven research. So we have two great speakers for you today. Associate Professor Rebecca Ford. Rebecca hasn't been at the university for very long. I'm sorry, I've lost track of how long, but not very long. I had the pleasure of being with her on a trip to China recently, which was rather arduous. Well, it was arduous for me. And I got to know Rebecca quite a bit during that trip. And I know that her research, which is basically about sustainability of local, regional and national food production, is one that she cares a great deal about, and she has a whole lot of expertise in this kind of area, and she's going to tell you about it. I have a confession to make with respect to Sue. I haven't met Sue until this evening, which is a strange thing, being the Dean of Research, and we have a major researcher who I haven't met. But I've certainly heard a lot about Sue's work beforehand, and so I think I know that her background is going to be of great interest to you, because she's a member of the Australian Rivers Institute, and she's got 20 years of experience in researching basically issues, as I understand it, around the social dimension of natural resource management in Australia. I'm particularly interested in the other dimension to her work, which is about customary Indigenous research rights and Indigenous capacity building. And that's a really important issue for Griffith University, because one of the things that you may not know about us is that we have more undergraduate Indigenous students than any university in Australia. And it's a growing area for us, particularly in terms of postgraduate work. One of the things that we really want to do that is really important is to grow the next generation of Indigenous researchers. So one of my personal mantras is that what we have to do is break down the dichotomy between researchers and Indigenous people. We don't want them to be different groups, we want them to be one and the same. And the only way we can do that is to grow our own students. Okay, and let me just say lastly, before I forget, of course, that Sue is a future fellow, an ARC future fellow with us. Just finally, a couple of quick organisational things. If you wouldn't mind controlling your natural enthusiasm to ask questions, it would be handy for us if we could do that all at the end. That would be really good. I think that Rebecca is going to speak first, and Sue after that in seamless fashion. One last thing is that you're probably sitting on, if you haven't noticed, a little questionnaire about whether you like the series and whether you think it's good and so forth. And there's also a card and things there that tells you the URL for our IMPACT website, which is quite useful, and you can if you want, you can get onto a list where you get automatically invitations to come to these IMPACT lecture series. So Rebecca and Sue, thanks very much for agreeing to do this. We look forward to your talk. I will adjudicate, if you don't mind, on the questions. And of course, the last thing I have the pleasure of doing is inviting you to join us for a cold beer or a glass of wine and canapes, and I assure you they'll be very good. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dave, for the introduction, and welcome to everyone. And thank you so much for coming along tonight to listen to what I have to say. Hopefully I can get the pitch right, and we can share some information and knowledge about the status of food security as it is around the world, and the issues that impact on that, and what sort of specific issues relate to the Australian situation. So I'm really going to focus more on the food side of things, and hopefully supply you with some information that you don't already know. I'm going to start off talking about the definition of food security, and then I'm going to go into talking about the global risks involved in securing sufficient food to feed our burgeoning global population. I'll then talk about the Australian situation and the risks to the production and maintaining that enough production to feed or to maintain our current export potential. I'll talk about opportunities and innovations and successes that are already occurring, and then touch on the sorts of policy reforms that have already taken place, and then what might be needed for future changes to occur to maintain that production. And then I'll just touch on the biological social nexus, and that will hopefully segue into Sue's presentation as I leave you. Okay, so food security is a melting pot of issues. It ranges from biological, environmental, social, governmental, policy-driven issues. But as the FAO defined it in the late 90s, it's when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So it's not just having enough food, it's having the right type of food to ensure dietary nutrition, as well as taking into account the cultural preferences that various types of people have around the globe. The global facts about productivity and security is that we do currently produce enough food to feed everyone in the world, and you may be surprised by that, but it's true. However, 1 billion plus people are still starving because they don't have adequate access or availability of food in their localised region. And 1 in 7 don't have enough protein and nutrients, so about 40,000 people die every day through hunger. And really this situation's going to be getting worse as the population increases, where by 2050 we're estimating to have approximately 9.6 billion people in our population. And that's a conservative estimate. That's the median amount. So really what we have to do in the next 40 years, leading up to 2050 or thereabouts, is to produce as much as we've ever produced in our entire history of food production. That's a scary thought, isn't it? So that really translates to producing an extra billion tonnes of cereal annually and an extra 200 million tonnes of meat annually. So you can see really the demand here between, is this working? Between the mid-90s through to 2025 here, that the demand increasing in both developing and developed countries here. Massive increase in demand. We have to do that whilst we overgrow our earth. So what I mean by that is back in 1950, of all of the acres of arable land or hectares of arable land that were available in the world, if you divided that up by the population size, it equated to everybody in the world having access or the availability to about 0.23 hectares per person. By 2050, given the increase in population size and the loss of arable land due to things that I'll talk about shortly, it's estimated that our available arable land per person is going to decrease to about 0.7 hectares per person. And so this is one of the major factors that's going to impact on the ability for people, potentially more in subsistence agricultural situations, to produce enough food to feed their families. At the same time, as I mentioned in that FAO definition of food security, culture is a very important issue, and we certainly have already seen an increase in the amount of protein consumption and the demand for that protein in the developing regions of the world. And so it's predicted that the per capita consumption of meat in particular is going to increase substantially. And again, you can see that substantial increase in the developing nations here. We're already seeing a higher demand for dairy products in the Asian countries, particularly China, and that demand for the high-end meat, red meat market as well. Well, what does that mean? What it means is that puts back into the system a massive demand on the resources that are required to produce those food products. And the example I'm giving here really is the amount of water required to produce a kilogram of a particular food type. And so you can see here that to produce food that would mainly feed sort of a vegetarian or a subsistence farming potato, where potato is a main food, you're looking at the lower end of the water demand to produce a kilogram of that type of foodstuffs. But when you start moving up to the meat, the red meat in particular, and this is really the amount of water for intensive beef production here, so intensive farming production, you can see a huge demand compared to the types of food products down here. Well, that also then kicks into producing the unwanted outputs that we currently see rising, including certain greenhouse gas emissions, and I guess if we're talking about intensive meat production, we're talking about methane production. But you can see here that about the food system, if you talk about it in its entirety, not just the agricultural side, but the processing and the packaging and the waste, all of the food system together accounts for about 50% of all of the human-produced greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a vicious cycle. We need to produce our food, we need to produce a lot more of it to feed this massive population increase, but at the same time, we need to do it in a smarter way, and we need to do it in a way where we can potentially not produce as much greenhouse gas emission that is impacting on our atmosphere in a cyclical way. So, just to sort of summarise the major global risks to production, and this is not in any particular order, they would probably boil down to the energy requirements. So we're talking about the energy to produce the food, the energy to process it, deliver it, including transport, and potentially cook it. We're talking about water that's required, and that kind of segues more into Sue's talk later. But the fact that water is becoming more scarce and is also changing in its composition in various ways around the world as the water table rises, as we see salination and other sorts of minerals becoming more concentrated in the water supply. So quality water scarcity. Disruptive practices, what I mean by that is that as traditional farmers, we have disrupted our land significantly. And that has led to issues regarding reduced fertility of our soils in particular, and I'll talk about that more shortly. But also things that we can't currently control include climate and extreme weather events, which we are likely to see more and more of as climate change progresses. Those include things like more often heavier rainfalls, less rainfall but more often severe rainfall events, storms, dust storms, these sorts of climatic situations. So I guess the big wicked problem that we're faced with as global citizens, and particularly as scientists and farmers and producers, is how to ensure sustained increased productivity at the same time as maintaining sustainability of our food systems and our wider ecosystems and environments. So how do we maintain a balance between our disruptive ways and our natural environment? So moving into the Australian situation, it's really about maintaining food security in the land of plenty. We're sitting pretty. As a country, we don't have to really worry about food production. We have very efficient and generally low input food systems, and that puts us in a really good situation where we export the majority of what we produce for very good returns on the export market. And in fact, in the grains industry, we're renowned for producing excellent quality grain that we receive fantastic premiums for, much better than many other places around the world. And a lot of that has been to do with our ability to source adequate water supplies, to apply adequate fertilizers and control our pests and pathogens through chemical usage. And so we really are in a very privileged situation in Australia, unlike many other parts of the world. And so currently Australia produces 93% of its domestic daily consumption of food, which means we only really need to import 7% of everything we eat. And 60% of what we produce, we export. So it's pretty good times at the moment. We've had our lean years, but this current year coming is predicted to be a bumper year for the cereals industries at this point in time. And so, yes, look, our food chain combined value is about $230 billion, and that's broken down into the categories of the amount produced on farm and fisheries and food processing, with a large proportion of it processed and out in the retail marketplace. And this is where well, this is actually just Victoria, because I couldn't find one for all of Australia, a graph that would help me explain it, but this is where most of the Victorian produce is exported. And you can see China, big market for us, or for Victorians. A lot of that's dairy, a lot of that's our red meat. A lot of grains go elsewhere around the world. So we're really feeding an enormous amount of people around the world. And when you put it like that, it's as if we have an ethical obligation to maintain that, I think, as a supplier of good food to the global population. You balance that with income, so gaining the best price for Australia to thrive. But certainly there is some form of ethical obligation to maintain a supply to feed the global population. However, it's not been such a pretty picture in recent years. We were sitting pretty for quite some time, and our global annual level of production was around about 2% here, 1.8% for quite some time. So we were ticking along nicely, and that was pretty good. And then around about 1998 through to about 2011, we went into a decline, which I'm sure you know the reason for that. We went into David mentioned it before, a substantially extended drought period. And so the total productivity, growth in productivity of our agricultural produce, the mean amount over that period of 1977 to 2011 was around about 1% per year all up. Not that good, but still on the positive side. As I said before, the forecast for this season is expected to be a bumper year. We're going to apparently be blowing the productivity history out of the market with a massive jump in 5.3% compared to previous years. And that's coming from prediction through the Australian Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, who are doing substantial surveying to correlate this data. So looking good for this year. However, there are these major risks to maintaining this productivity, this ethical obligation, this income from export demand. Our major priority, our major risk is water availability. Our joint major risk is working with these ancient and infertile soil types the fact that we have significant land degradation that's already occurred and is still occurring. And that includes things like erosion, acidification, salt, and encroachment on our arable lands from urban planning. We have harsh climates compared to a lot of the rest of the world. We're in a semi-arid, and most of our crops down south are considered to be in a semi-arid region with low water. And we have the issue of our emissions and the looming energy crisis. And lastly, I want to touch on our wasteful ways. So, water availability. I'm not going to go into this in any depth, but just to say that drought has reduced our annual wheat production in those bad years by more than 60%. So on an annual basis, we've lost about $3.6 billion through drought of non-irrigated, well, including some irrigation, but rain-fed crops. However, Australia consumes a huge amount of water per year, and over 70% of that is related to irrigation of our food crops, and only 21% is for industry and urban uses. So massive amounts of our water is going to growing our food. Makes sense. And subsequently, there has been huge investment in water infrastructure around the country. This is the Snowy River pipeline here, and this is unfortunately the end of the Murray-Darling Basin here. I won't go into those, but suffice to say, there are ongoing massive debates about access to water and the balance that needs to be sought and agreed upon between uses for agriculture and food crops versus maintaining our natural environments and the biodiversity that exists in those. And being dropped, and I'm sure there are several people in the audience that are very well aware of this, and I think we'll see this debate stirring up again in the coming few months, potentially when our current government starts to deal with these sorts of issues. We have this issue of diminishing arable lands, and one of the major reasons in Australia for this is accelerated soil erosion. So not only have we got these ancient and infertile soil types, we have accelerated the erosion of them through our farming practices. And one of those major reasons is the use of tillage, which is turning over the soil at the end of the cropping season to aerate and for pest and disease management as well, to expose it to the UV, and maybe to plough in the stubble as a nitrogen source for the next growing season. But by doing that, the soil structure is being disrupted. And soil acidification is occurring. We have 50 million hectares with a surface pH of less than 5.5, which is the borderline pH for plants, for most food crop plants to exist in a healthy state. Anything less than that and they start to go into a stress situation, and that then impacts the quantity and the quality of the food that's produced. We have changed water tables occurring where we're losing almost 6 million hectares through dryland salinity. And we have intensive storm events. As I touched on before, we have these dust storms in particular, which are related to poor soil structure. And this graph just shows over the period of 96 to 99 where the majority of those storms have occurred. And you might say, well, they're not really where crops are grown, it's in the middle of Australia. However, if you just look down here, this is actually a major cropping region, the Wimmera Mallee region of Australia, where a lot of grain crops are grown. I don't know if you've ever experienced a dust storm out there, but it's an interesting thing to try and drive through, almost impossible. So there's estimates of further sheet erosion, so whole swaths of land being eroded, and these estimates are based on previous erosions. They're based on seasonal greenest measures and rainfall regimes. And so you can see here a lot of this is predicted to occur in the northern growing regions in particular, and would affect our tropical production regions. At the same time, we have diminishing arable land through urban encroachment. I know I'm touching on a variation of subjects here. I'm just trying to cover the breadth of what food security for Australia really means, and I don't think we can do that completely without talking about this juxtapose between the need to house people and their preference for where they live compared to where the food bowls, the historical food bowls have been for our urban environments, for feeding our cities in particular. And so we have this growth of population and expansion of these urban communities moving and encroaching onto the best soils that exist around our cities. And the reason that they are the best soils really is because, or the best places to grow plants, is because they're usually where people have developed their population because they're protected from extreme weather events. You know, we humans like to live in comfortable places. And there's direct access to recycled water and reliable labour. So it made sense to populate these areas as well as create a fringe food production system. But they're also the best places to live because they're close to the city. So that's a big issue at the moment. Just to give you some statistics on that, Melbourne's food bowl produces about 40% of the fresh produce that's eaten in Melbourne. So, and that includes about 100% of all the poultry and eggs, and 82% of the vegetables. So, and of that, the inner food bowl, it produces 92% of the fresh berries and so on. So, very, very important to feeding these large populations within Australia. But it's predicted that by 2050, Melbourne will only be able to supply about 18% of its food demand due to this urban sprawl and population growth. And so, interestingly, Queensland was the first government to put forward a proposal and a policy to quarantine strategically cropping land around these urban fringes, and they've come up with this method of using trigger maps where if anyone here who has a Queensland property wants to build in particular areas of Queensland, you actually have to apply through your planning permission. You have to actually apply using a trigger map as well to see what the risk is to food security, which I think is fantastic. And it takes into account the soil type, the land type and climatic information as well. Okay, so we have this historic knowledge that we are a nation of extreme weather events, and that we know that climate affects every aspect of the food production system. So right through from the animals and the plants used to the yields and the qualities that we can reap, the areas where farming can occur, and the types of costs that go into producing that food around climate management. I shouldn't say climate management, managing our crops in response to climate risk. So here are some stark realities. We have an average minimum day temperature increase since 1910 of around about 0.7 degrees centigrade. And we have an average minimum night temperature increase of around about 1.1 degrees centigrade. And really what we're seeing is today and into the future is the potential for more serious weather events and prolonged drought periods. And this is the graph that I would like to use to demonstrate that, where you're seeing on the graph each point is a mean temperature and an anomaly in above the mean temperature at that particular point and you can see there's definitely an increase in the number of anomalies over the mean average temperatures at that point. And that graph was created by data taken from between 1961 and 1990. And so you would then, well, I would like to say we're already in, and so would the Climate Commission, if they still existed, or they do in some respect. They would like to say that we are already in a new climate, that we can already see that we've moved. Our climate has shifted to a warmer one and is progressively getting warmer. Where we've already seen over 100 weather records broken in a single season, including the hottest month and the hottest day. So undeniably, we have a weather situation that is going to impact on our ability to produce food into the future. And more specifically, the ways that temperature, for instance, impacts on grain production. Plants will flower faster when they're exposed to more radiation, types of radiation, and warmer climates. They will start to flower faster, and there will be reduced water due to increased temperature. There'll be reduced water in the soils. And so they will move into a senescence, an end of growth period, and they will set seed faster because plants in a stress situation will reproduce faster to get out of that situation as fast as they can. Generally, we're going to see lower qualities and lower yields. But at the same time, with increased CO2, many of my colleagues are working on how this impacts on the amount that's produced by plants. And the CO2 that they're finding produces greater biomass. So there may actually be more produced, but the quality of that product will differ. And we're already seeing that the distribution of particular proteins within grains is changed under elevated CO2 conditions. So we're really looking at different food, different quality of food, as well as an impact on the amount of food, the quantity of food produced. And this really nicely shows how climate's going to impact on our growing regions. And really what I've circled is 3 different agro-geographical regions where food is produced. And I've kind of focused on grains because that's my research area. But in the west here, the grain growing area, we've got the southern grain growing belt here, and we've got the sort of northern New South Wales, central Queensland growing belt there. If you overlay that as the arable growing regions with the trend in mean temperature rise, you can start to see the impacts that might have on our food production. Where you see the major increase in temperature rise, it's already being seen. And where that's occurring, it's actually overlaid over those regions of major food production. Okay, it's a vicious cycle, as I said before. Greenhouse gas emissions, about 18% is derived from agriculture, but there's a lot of other reasons for greenhouse gas emissions, so we're not just focusing on agriculture. I just wanted to make that a point that it's not a fix-all, that if we can reduce emissions from agriculture, we've fixed climate change. Okay, another thing I want to flip to quickly is our wasteful ways, and this is the RAP report back in 2009, which shows that a lot of our waste is coming from the best food. It's coming from fresh fruit and salads, where the brown is the avoidable waste, so we've thrown away edible food. The light colour here is possibly avoidable, and blue is we can't avoid it. It's stuff we cut off because you can't eat it. Offal usually, that sort of thing. But look at all the different sorts of foods that's avoidable that we're wasting. And if we go to the Australian situation, this is the huge amount of food that we're wasting per year in Australia. You'll find that in the What a Waste report. And so we really need to move towards transformational change in our production systems to counteract this wide range of situations that's impacting on our food security. One of the first things we can talk about is renewable energy on farm, right? And so there's a diversity of natural resource available to us right now as producers that we could be tapping into. And around the world, people are tapping into it for irrigation. Look at this, it's amazing, for wind power, mainly for irrigation purposes. And recently the New South Wales Farmers Association called on governments to back the transition from fossil fuels, which is a really big statement for the Farmers Association. It's technology that's already in place in many developing regions of the world, and I'd like to know where the government incentives are for this to occur in this country right now. We're moving, as humanity, we're moving to precision farming practices where we are direct drilling, for instance. We're not doing tillage so much anymore. We're putting the seed directly into the ground. There's been a massive uptake around Australia of around about 60% of this, doing this. We're also using very precise satellite guided technologies, GPS positioning to plant our crops, to fertilise them, to treat them for pests and pathogens, where farmers have maps of their paddocks and they know exactly where in their paddock they need to apply a particular chemical. So that reduces runoff, it reduces environmental pollution, and it reduces on costs and the cost of producing the product. So we're already in the age of, I call it cyber farming. We have a rise in the urban food production movement where we're seeing a lot more home food growing, community gardens and allotments, and intentional communities. And some examples include the Darebin City Council, who have put out this urban food production strategy. This is a Melbourne Victorian council, really ahead of their time, or actually probably with us right now, and most of us are behind. Sanford Commons and the Milan Farms, fantastic community drive happening in these places to increase the amount of food that's produced in people's gardens or in intentional communities. I'm involved in this group, the Southern Moreton Bay Islands Food Growers Group. Yay, the 4 islands. Anyone heard of them? Russell, Macleay, Lamb, Carragara? Yeah. So
been there for about 14 months.
Yeah, great. I've got a house on Russell. But we are working together to provide the opportunities for people to know how to grow food at home. So look me up and come and get involved. So we also see these organisations popping up who are involved in the redistribution of food. So rather than food going directly to the tip and being chucked into the ground, it's being rescued. And I was involved in some research looking at how did the amount of rescued food equate to energy savings and greenhouse gas emission savings. And we calculated that this is how much you'd save from rescuing 1 million kilograms of fresh food, which is about what Second Bite do per year. It's a lot of savings there. But we really need to start thinking about policy reforms. We've exhausted our past agricultural sector reforms. It's very quiet at the moment, and I was having this conversation with a couple down the front. The government's very quiet at the moment, and there's a feeling that there's going to be a growing momentum in this as the realisations start rolling through. But I guess there's a lot of questioning about the sort of investments that need to be made. The National Food Plan, which was released a few years ago now, but had some statements in it about producing food sustainability and adopting innovative practices, renewable energies, and whilst protecting the environment and reducing our per capita food waste. And I think, ABARES, for instance, have made very recent recommendations about things like facilitating structural adjustment and efficient resource use across farms. Again, renewable energies, transformational changes, reducing unnecessarily regulatory burdens, Okay, investing in research and development. And let's just hope that there is going to be a lot more investment occurring in research and development to improve the efficiency of our agricultural systems. Building capital through improving labour availability, so education for the next wave of producers. There's some investment already in place, so we've got $600 million under the Caring for Our Country Sustainable Agriculture stream. We've got $15 billion in the Water for Our Future initiative. And we have now a national waste policy that we didn't have before. So there are strategies being put into place, which is excellent. I'm going to leave it there. I just want to quickly, oh, sorry, no, I'm not. I'm going to talk about the nexus with societal impact. So very quickly, it's not all about production. It's also, as I mentioned before, in the global context, even the Australian context, it's about access and availability. So it's about access in terms of the capacity for people to actually get the food in the first place. So the ability to buy it, so the price of the food, the ability to store it and prepare it, knowledge about preparing it in appropriate ways. And also I've added one there about sovereignty, and I'm not going to go into this talk, but that's a whole other area about who owns the food chains, who ties them up. And you would be horrified to know how few people or how few companies actually own the majority of the food that is available to us. And availability, so location of outlets, availability of stores, and those sorts of things, pricing. So who currently experiences food insecurity in Australia, given that we're a mass producer and we export most of what we produce? We still have hungry people here. And that gives you an idea of the sorts of communities that are underprivileged in their access and their availability to good, wholesome, nutritious food of their cultural preference in Australia, which is quite shocking. And a lot of that is to do with the rising price of quality food. And you can see here over time how, in fact, of particular note is the increase in the price of fruit and veg here. And a lot of that was obviously to do with the drought. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I want to acknowledge wonderful people, Rebecca Lindbergh at Second Bite, and one of my former mentors, Craig, at the NSSI. And just to let you know, I'm part of this Environmental Futures Research Institute, and invite you to ask some questions after Sue's presentation and to approach me afterwards for a chat. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Rebecca, for that really comprehensive presentation on so many of the issues that are important to us when we think about food and water security. Can everybody up back hear me? A bit louder? Would you like me to use the microphone, or is that better? That's better? Okay, just signal if I start to fade away, will you please? So I'm going to narrow the focus quite a bit now and talk about North Australia. And I'm going to talk specifically about a subset of the Australian population that you probably wouldn't be at the forefront of your mind when you're thinking about food and water security, and that's about Indigenous communities in North Australia. I want to tonight do a couple of things. I want to consider the implications of our agricultural policy and rural land use developments and trajectories, initiatives, and consider the implications for meeting the needs, the food and water and cultural needs of Indigenous communities in North Australia. And I'll do that by profiling some research that we've been conducting in North Australia during the last decade under a consortia called the Tropical Rivers and Coastal Knowledge Hub. And that research has been trying to better understand the values of tropical rivers and northern environments, and to weigh up the values, weigh up the costs and benefits of development scenarios. And I'll do that while I'm profiling that research. I'm going to reveal the hidden value of bush foods and aquatic environments to Indigenous communities. And very briefly, I then want to identify some of the policy settings that could be used to enhance opportunities for Indigenous communities in North Australia and mitigate some of the risks from some development options. Now, I first want to just briefly give you an overview of context here, thinking about North Australia, tropical North Australia, where we have a very sparsely distributed population of low density, population of about 1 million people in total. More than a quarter of that population is Indigenous, and there's quite a distinct difference in socioeconomic standing between the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous communities in North Australia, with Indigenous communities in particular experiencing multiple sources of disadvantage that are evident in literacy rates, education rates, employment rates, and a whole range of areas, and as well, I'm sure you're aware, in some health differentials, mortality rates, for example. There's also another very important feature to the geography of North Australia, and that is its land tenure. So more than a third of the region is now held under forms of Aboriginal title, in particular native title, representing more than the entire jurisdictions of New South Wales and Victoria. So that's a very substantial area. You can see here in this map, the blue areas are all the native title claims that have come on board in the last 20 years or so. This orange area being a non-exclusive native title and the yellow being the non-exclusive native title, but the orange being freehold title that came through with Northern Territory land rights law. Less in North Queensland, but still very high rates of Indigenous ownership. Now, Indigenous communities in these regions still practice hunting and fishing activities. They use many of the resources according to custom, local custom, and local institutions of resource management. And this represents or presents this interplay between customary systems of governance and the mainstream state systems of governance represents or introduces a degree of complexity to managing our northern environments and to development projects as well. We have complexity in our social catchments with very diverse cultural communities speaking many different languages. In the Fitzroy Valley region, for example, in an area where there's 30 distinct Indigenous communities, those communities are scattered through an area of 7 ethno-linguistic groups. So this is an important feature of this region that we're talking about, where communities are very closely attached to really healthy river systems. Now, this map that's been produced by colleagues of mine at the Australian Rivers Institute shows in green the very healthy river systems that are largely unregulated. Very few dams, very few impoundments, very few structures that are affecting the flows of these river systems. We have some dams around Kununurra, Darwin, and some impacts here in the Gulf country through impoundments, but really, on the whole, very healthy river systems. And that are at times of the year very, very wet, of course, with the wet season flows. And the north of Australia contains approximately 60% of Australia's total water, but very little of this is currently diverted, with less than 1% of the land area being devoted to irrigated agriculture. And in more recent decades, we've come to appreciate some of the conservation values, the biodiversity values that are associated with these unregulated, healthy river systems. That have been long targeted for agricultural development. In the last century, we've seen periodic high levels of interest in growing rice, for example, growing other crops, food crops, intensifying agricultural development. In the more recent period, we've come to realise that there are actually some quite substantial limitations to developing North Australia for agriculture, including limitations relating to the soil, the hydrology, the topography, the low relief that provides very few places for impoundments and for dams, for example, as well as a whole range of economic issues that constrain development. But nonetheless, we still see this ongoing, quite persistent interest in notions of drought proofing and growing food for Asia, foodbowl. The push for a foodbowl, for example, is a very prevalent concept and sometimes presented quite simplistically in public debates about the future of North Australia. The very recent manifestation of that is the coalition government white paper that looks at food, looks at developing North Australia and puts food and agribusiness as a top priority for its agenda for developing the North. It places an emphasis on securing land and water rights for development, investing in development, putting more money into dams, research, hydrological research. And throughout much of this report at least, but particularly some of the popular debate that you'll hear from on radio, for example, people like Alan Jones and others, is a discourse of waste that is quite worrying to, I think, a number of people who've been working and living in this area for a long time, where the assumption is that the water is going out to sea, it's not being used for anything, it's wasted, the rivers are lazy, and all of this potential can be unlocked by governments that cut tape and get on with the business of development. And one of the things that's apparent in all of this kind of simplistic analysis is that agriculture tends to be promoted as really the answer to a development problem, when many of us who've been working in this part of the country for a long time realise that there are many other ways in which the region is productive, and there are many uses of those waters and the river systems. There are also trade-offs, and if you are to make choices about the development trajectory, you can very well face competing values, competing interests. And we know that we're in the middle of, or have come some way through quite a historic re-evaluation of resources, moving away from industrial resources, moving away from a preoccupation or a focus on agriculture and industrial values to post-industrial values that include a lot of the conservation values that I mentioned, as well as Indigenous interests and tourism and amenity values. Now, this is reflected in some of the research that was undertaken by colleagues in CSIRO and CDU and the TRACK program, where many hundreds of people across the country were surveyed and asked questions about how they wanted to see tropical rivers managed. And you can see this very strong preference for preservation of biodiversity and natural habitat, preserving rivers for the people who live there. Producing food for Australia is undoubtedly very important to many of the people. Developing North Australia per se, less so, and providing food for the world came last of those priorities. And throughout these surveys, when you look at the results and interpret the results, you can see a very strong emphasis being given to conservation, but also being given to the rights and the needs of Indigenous people, the need to balance development with the existing communities and their aspirations for continuing to use resources. Now, this is quite. This takes me to the guts of what I want to talk about today, which is a picture that came through on my Facebook feed when people from this group, Young, Black and Deadly, posted this picture of bush tucker, where this man was saying, "We're the fresh food people, not Woolworths." So, you know, it's a comical take on our the mainstream industrial system and their ways of securing food, versus one that's highly valued in regional and remote Australia, where Indigenous people are practising these ways of obtaining food, and one that is a very important source of identity. And we, having done research in this area for a long time, often hear people talking about rivers and wetlands and floodplains as supermarkets. This traditional owner said, "We believe the river provides for us properly and for birds and animals. If something did happen, it's our life. It provides bush tucker for us traditional owners." So this is a concept of the environment providing food, being a supermarket, providing an ecosystem service. That's a common concept in science these days, and we were very much aware that this was an important one to explore in our research. So the TRACK project that I'm going to talk about in detail now was titled Indigenous Socioeconomic Values and River Flows. What we did was explored very closely the link between Indigenous people livelihoods and river health. We knew that customary use of resources, bush tucker, aquatic wildlife, fish, plants and vegetables being obtained from the wild could be high. We knew that this could make an economic contribution to households, but we didn't have a sense of exactly how important it was, the extent of the contribution, the composition. What species were people harvesting? What were the relationships or the links between those species and their flow requirements, their needs for water? And also, how might we think about ways of minimising impacts of any changes that to flow regimes, to the way in which rivers work, that might come about by developing areas for farming, for example. So this research set out to answer some of those questions. We did over a 4-year program, established relationships with communities in 3 case study areas. We undertook case study work in the Fitzroy River Valley in the Kimberley, in the Daly River catchment, in the Northern Territory, and in the Mitchell River area of the Gulf or the Cape in Queensland. And at the same time, we had other researchers, biophysical researchers and economists and others working in these catchments under this large program, and you'll see the benefit of that shortly when I come to talk about some of the results. So we did surveys over 2 years. We negotiated research agreements with traditional owners to ensure that the communities understood why we wanted to gather the data and to make sure they didn't feel it was too intrusive. We collected information from over 100 surveys that were conducted over a sequence of periods over 2 years through semi-structured interviews to ask people exactly what they were catching, from where, so that we could build up a really clear picture of the types of resources people were harvesting, from where and at what times of year. We then used an economic method to calculate the replacement value. So all of these goods that are being obtained from rivers and wetlands and billabongs, they don't have a price, they don't come with a market value. So if you want to try and think about their economic value, you need to find a proxy. So we used this method that has been used before in various parts of the world and said, well, if you obtained a fish from a wetland and you had to go and try and you couldn't then obtain that fish, but you had to replace what you got from that, the fish, the nutritional value, the protein, the amount of meat, you had to replace that from buying the equivalent from a store, well then what would it cost you? So that's how you work out the replacement method. We sat down and analysed the results and found that we could see that people were catching 56 or harvesting 56 species across all 3 catchments. 12 were in common to all. On average, people went out about 1.3 times per fortnight per household. The species that they were harvesting in greatest numbers were relatively abundant and widespread. And I suppose when most people were out walking around, you'd expect that people are going to go and find the ones that are easiest to catch. And they're the ones that were relatively abundant and widespread. More than 90% of the value of the harvest was accounted for by a small subset of species. But the total was distributed across a large number of sites. And this had implications for thinking about ways in which water planners could look at minimising risks to this use of the environment. Now, I'll show some slides now that present some of the data for you. This is a graph showing the 10 most harvested species harvested in the greatest numbers from the Daly River in the Northern Territory. So you can see here that long-necked turtle was caught in the greatest number, with about 2,300 or so being caught over the time of the surveys. A very high number of lotus lilies, black brim, magpie geese, going down through to catfish. So showing quite a few fish species, some magpie geese and turtle, quite an array there of species being caught in the Daly River. Now in the Fitzroy River in the Fitzroy catchment, we get a different composition. Bony brim caught in similar numbers to the long-necked turtle, bony brim caught in similar numbers to the long-necked turtle, but spangled perch, black brim, catfish, all these fish species in high numbers. We then move into some of the crustaceans, the freshwater crayfish, mussel and crab, frog which was caught for bait, and another 2 fish species. In the Mitchell, we get a different composition again. Magpie geese eggs in really high numbers there, catfish and barramundi, black brim, but importantly some of these saltwater species coming through where because the mouth of the community was closer to the mouth of the river there, and the Mitchell. Now, when you do the replacement value method and you actually calculate what these resources are worth to the community, you come out with some interesting results, and I'll run through them for each of the catchments. So this shows the most valuable species according to this replacement method. The long-necked turtle was harvested to an amount that represents over $50,000 for that community. The short-necked turtle, which was quite a deal less, was about 15,000, with barramundi coming in just over 10,000, black brim and so on. With the species, even though they're quite large here, this species of shark being harvested very infrequently. And so in some respects, these figures can reflect the size of the animal, where the largest bodied animal gives the greatest amount of meat. So it's also a factor of the numbers. Now, this graph shows it's concentrating on the Daly River again, but this is a graph that shows mean fortnightly value by household. So how much is each household on average getting from each of the species? And we can see here that long-necked turtle by household was providing about $27 a fortnight through this time period that we were surveying. Short-necked turtle was a little over $10, barramundi a little bit less again for black brim. In total, per fortnight, the consumption that was coming from the wild in these aquatic resources represented about $70 per household. In the Fitzroy, the dollar values were far less, representing black brim in the highest numbers here, and the greatest value of less than $12,000. Catfish comes in second, and that comes down to about 6,000 or 7,000 and so on. So we get a different distribution here, or a different ordering of the species, but still contributing dollars to the community. In the Mitchell River, again, we can see the very significant contribution that barramundi is giving. Now, you remember the species that was harvested in the greatest numbers in the Mitchell was the magpie geese eggs, but because of the very large size of barramundi and the number that are caught, the barramundi ends up bringing in close to $18,000 in this community. And black brim and the others go down as I've set out there. Now, we know from the research that's being undertaken by the consortia, the TRAC consortia, and by others in this region, that there's a very strong positive relationship between various aquatic species and flow, and river flow. So in this graph here, we see the relationship between wet season flow. The larger the wet season flow, the higher the barramundi catch. And others of my colleagues have done the similar kind of work with mud crab and with prawn, showing this really strong association between unregulated heavy, unregulated and large flowing river systems and their ability to produce food for the non-Indigenous population. But we didn't know how important these rivers were for the non-Indigenous community. And we also were able, with this research, to start to think about the impacts of influencing those flow regimes, any kind of impacts on water resource development. This is a graph that my colleague Mark Kennard produced with his colleagues in a project that was running parallel, that shows the fish species from the Daly River along here and their vulnerability to dry season water extraction. So it shows here that these species on this end of the table are at higher risk, the greatest risk, from taking water out of the dry season, out of the rivers or the ground during the dry season. Now, when you think about the species that Aboriginal people are using, thinking back again, this is the Daly River, to the first table I showed, with a number of fish species being harvested in very significant numbers, in the top 10 are at this end of being at very high risk from dry season extraction. So we said to the water planners, it's really important that you start to think about these species that are being used by Aboriginal people being harvested by Aboriginal people. But in the early days of the research, before we got well underway, what the water planners were looking at with respect to fish species was only barramundi. They were only looking at the water needs of barramundi, of course, because it's so important to the recreational fishing sector. So the research was able to say, well, you've got to start thinking more comprehensively about a greater range of species and connections. So I now want to bring us back to this notion that Rebecca raised of food insecurity, and think about our results in the context of this question about access to resources. Now, national nutrition studies, national health policies have associated and have made a very strong statement about the importance of good food for Indigenous communities. They've identified, as Rebecca said, Indigenous people at high risk of food insecurity. Now, one study has found that 19% of the health difference, the health gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can be attributed to diet-related causes, and that all the policies in these areas recommend improved access to more nutritious and affordable foods. But this is very much dependent on having the financial resources to do so. And we know from many of these surveys, the Australian Health Survey, for example, that Indigenous people are particularly disadvantaged in this regard. 1 in 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in a household where someone went without food when that household ran out in the sampling period or in the period prior to the sampling period. That compares with only 1 in 25 non-Indigenous people. Indigenous people in remote areas suffer an even higher rate of disadvantage. They were more likely than those in non-remote areas to go without food in the period before the survey was run. We know from other studies that the Australian Bureau of Statistics has run that the North is financially stressed, with 30%, nearly a third of Indigenous households experiencing difficulties paying for everyday needs, including their food. And that food is very expensive in these regions, in these communities. The food prices can be up to 50% higher than in capital cities. So when you think about that context, we've been able to use this data to draw out some of the implications for Indigenous communities, to think about the cost and think about equity, and to think about some of the distributional impacts should development adversely affect the harvests. So this is a table here. I'm sorry that's so faint there, but these are the catchments, the Fitzroy, the Daly and the Mitchell. And really it's probably this bottom line here that we want to concentrate on, where we've calculated the total fortnightly consumption value, showing that in the Fitzroy people obtained on a fortnightly basis per household nearly $36, and that represented about 2.2% of household income. In the Daly, it was $70. As I mentioned before, the total harvest represented this $70, representing about 5.2% household income. But because we had this other data that the track researchers were gathering, we were able to say, well, not only look at income, but look at how much are people spending in these communities on food. So Natalie Stokel, a colleague at JCU, James Cook University, she'd done surveys and she knew that in the Daly River people were spending a certain amount that our amounts represented such that they represented 13% of the food consumption, or equated to 13% of food consumption. In the Mitchell, where people were gathering about $100 a fortnight, it equated to nearly 23% of the amount that people were spending on food. So if there's any impact from, say, taking water out of rivers or the ground, any impact felt on the harvest, then that's extra money that already disadvantaged communities that are financially stressed are going to have to find. We know also from our work in this region that food represents, and these aquatic resources, this bush tucker represents only one dimension of the very many reasons why Indigenous people go hunting and fishing as regularly as they do. The food is, of course, reliable, available, highly nutritious. There are health benefits in going out and getting it. But these practices are also very important to Indigenous communities. The resources themselves are of symbolic importance in Indigenous life in local belief systems. They're a source of cultural inspiration. And this is also represented in other national surveys. The Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders survey that's undertaken every 5 years or so has surveyed people right across the country and found that more than half of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people go hunting and fishing. It's very high in remote areas and very high for people with children. So this is a practice that's undertaken regularly, it's highly valued, and it enables people to also maintain connections to country and to express cultural preferences for certain types of foods. And we know that from our own work in these regions that some foods, for example, some fish species are substituted for meat during times of mourning, for example, when someone dies. So there are all these other meanings associated with hunting and fishing that we need to also think of. And you can see that in our data, which I can show here, the same daily river figures that you saw before. This darker bar shows the harvest, the 2300 long-necked turtle. But the light bar here, for each of these species, is a matching light bar. That represents the lighter grey, the actual amount consumed by the household that was surveyed. So the difference represents that was traded, or I should say exchanged or gifted within the community, beyond the community, amongst family, amongst kin. So people are out hunting and fishing, and they're passing those goods around, they're exchanging them, and this is a really important part of social life. Now the next thing I want to move to was a piece of work that we undertook once we came together as a group of ecologists, ecologists, geographers and economists, and we said, look, let's start thinking about some of the development scenarios and the ways in which increase in farming, for example, taking more water out of the river or out of the ground could affect Indigenous communities. And let's start to try and think about the net impact if we can. So talk about the impact on the harvest of wild resources. But what might happen under various scenarios? And so the team was able to say, let's look into the future in the next 30 years and let's say, what might happen under one scenario, increasing agricultural activity by 5% per annum. So the team was then able to use data from various aspects and dimensions of the projects and to build up a model that gave us some answers to that. And I can show these figures here that if you were to increase agricultural production by 5% per annum in the daily river, you could bring about, under the worst case scenario, the high water use scenario, you could bring about a change in the river discharge, the amount of water flowing out from the river system, which could reduce it by 65%. That would affect the habitat in which the resources that we've just been looking at. That could reduce that habitat and potentially the catch by about 90%. Now, by promoting agriculture and having more people employed in agriculture, producing agriculture for export, you might end up from that scenario increasing the non-Indigenous income by 12%. But the Indigenous income doesn't increase by the same amount. And this is an important difference. The relative gain of the Indigenous community isn't as great because Indigenous people aren't as closely connected to the production side of the economy by virtue of not being employed in the agricultural industries, not owning businesses, etc. So this is an important difference that needs to be taken into account and offset against the losses to the Aboriginal harvest and the Aboriginal subsistence. So that worst case scenario, just to give some figures there, I mentioned that total consumption was about $70 per household per person, it represented about $370 a year. If we were to increase agriculture, as I said, per annum, we could put most of that at risk. And we weren't looking at terrestrial species, which also would no doubt be affected by changes in agricultural land use through land clearing, for example. Due to these weak connections between Indigenous people and the production side of the economy, the income gain wasn't as strong as I mentioned for Indigenous people. So it's important that not only do we look at ways of reducing the risks, the environmental impacts of of agricultural development, you really also need to look at ways of ensuring that Indigenous people can gain from that economic development. One way is through institutional connections, through the ways of the property rights regimes, through training and through employment, and some of these other connections and means by which Indigenous people benefit from any agricultural development that does occur. So I mentioned that in the beginning that Indigenous people have a very large land base, but some of the institutional policy settings don't work as well as they could at the moment to ensure that Indigenous people could gain from any of those development trajectories or development paths that are envisaged under current policy and current land use agendas. One that I've had some interest in for some time relates to water resource development. The fact that, for example, native title law has a very narrow definition of water rights at the moment. So, for example, Indigenous people do not have any right to develop, to gain from the commercial development of water. So if you are to increase agricultural development, increase farming, introduce water trading systems, etc., if you lock Aboriginal people out of that, then you won't see them gaining from economic development, and it might just be the case that they end up being on the other side of the ledger as the ones that experience a lot of the costs of development, as I've outlined with the resource use, the subsistence economy. And the other area that Indigenous groups are really involved in at the moment in North Australian development debates is around natural resource management, about community-based environmental services, where many groups are now organising at the local scale to contribute to environmental management activities, and they're looking for ways of earning revenue through that so they can sustain those activities and contribute to their livelihoods. So Indigenous organisations, representative organisations, are looking for ways in which we can strengthen those institutions, community-based natural institutions, and to ensure that Indigenous people are fairly involved in environmental management and research activities that roll out as we get more and more interested in developing the norms and more development activity takes place. So just to wrap up then, I want to emphasise that hunting and fishing is really important to many of the Indigenous communities in North Australia. It's very important to their diets, it's very important to the household economy, it also is very important for social reasons. It enables people to maintain important communal aspects of social life and economic life. And so it's very important for our food security, for our agricultural policy, for our rural land use policies and urban development programs and agendas, to think about the risks of their propositions, their trajectories, their initiatives for a distinct population that has a really important connection to country and an important set of ways of relating to land and water. And this is a population that has existing uses and benefits from the very healthy root systems that we have in the north. It's very important for us to understand those ecosystem services that are currently being delivered by the rivers and the wetlands, the billabongs, the floodplains, for us to go beyond very narrow investigations that don't take into account this customary economy. And we must include in environmental flows assessments and all of our development assessments, we must include consideration of these economically and culturally valuable species to make sure that at the same time that we're thinking about mitigating risks, we're also looking at the net benefits from agricultural development or North Australian development, and we're thinking about ways of enhancing opportunities for Indigenous communities as we go. So thank you very much. I've also got some acknowledgements, very importantly all the traditional owners that gladly I can say filled out our surveys and were involved in other dimensions of the research, and also colleagues of mine from the tropical rivers and coastal knowledge. Like others, Mark Kennard was here, and my colleague from CSIRO, and I'm with him,